Fire away when Ridley. There we are, starting. Hello, everybody. You actually hear some clickety clacks. And tortuganwordpress.com, the exciting world of my website. And if you don't have that on your website, why the hell not? That's where I've got my troubles in paradise. Eventually, thanks to Peter, hopefully we will eventually have things where I can do more professional looking stuff so I don't look like some geek in Spokane that doesn't know what the hell I'm doing. And we've got a variety of guests here today who we will be weighing in on. We have Aetivists and Peter and Jackson, who is still temporarily muted. I will just unmute him so he's okay and he can jump in.
Everything. I never said
at
any point that I was going to do YouTube the whole time I was here. No. Not even most of it. Not even most of it.
You're just planning your time around YouTube. You drove 4 hours to hang out with me. You're not.
And I'm going to hang out. Oh, hey guys, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
We can hear both of you.
Yes, we've got a conversation going on. He's muted. Okay. Now, what I've got is a busy show today, in addition to the guests that we'll be getting to momentarily. But the fun part is that we're continuing my dissection of Rupi and Sanford's book, which I will hold up for all to see. This is, by the way, this is my 50th Evolution Hour episode. Isn't that exciting? I don't know whether that's considered a giant milestone or not. And we'll see what happens if I'm still going around at 100. But I have kept up every bloody week on these things. Anyway, as you are aware from the last 10, 12 weeks, I'm going in and analyzing the scholarship, in air quotes, of the creationist Rupi and Sanford in this contested bone book that was given to me by somebody who had wanted to hear about the project but didn't want to go through and deal with it in great detail themselves. So they had sent it to it, and away we go. And I'm happy to do so, and it adds to my library. It also demonstrates the whole technique of how you do source analysis on anything. Nobody needs to necessarily be as anal retentive as I am, going through every single source, but that's what you can do or do in segments. And the reason why I saw the need to do this is that I immediately spotted the fact that the guys had no bibliography in the book. They had no index. So it was very hard to find out what information was or was not in the text unless you plowed through one by one by one. So I wanted to see that. I wanted to do a measurement of how many sources they had, how many of them were technical sources, were they being used for authority quotes, or were they actually offering data points? If they are offering data points, are the data points justified by the sources or not? And so I've been delving into all of that. At the moment, about half of their sources are used for authority quotes, and only about a third of their sources are really technical literature. Of the technical literature they cite, about a quarter of it is misrepresented right off the bat, and the rest of it is just either for authority quotes or non-controversial. They're saying the equivalent of the sun rising in the east. It's not a point of debate. Now I'm going to put up, we'll do my little show and tell here, which I generated this little simplistic chart, and it will demonstrate, however, what the point I want to say. So we are going into screen share mode, and everybody should see hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2. Everybody see that? Hopefully.
Yes.
The ideal thing, everybody's got a data stream. You got A, B, C, D, E, F, G. There's a bunch of data, and all of which needs to be accounted for. But what you really want to see if you're testing rival hypotheses is the if and only if issue. So ideally, you should have X and maybe more than just X, where if our hypothesis is true, X has got to be true. But if X is not true, you got a serious problem, because it must be so. So if our hypothesis is true, a competing hypothesis, X cannot be the case. Not X, must be so in order for hypothesis 2 to work. Likewise, you can have a negative case applying to your first hypothesis, and in a true alternative, the opposite is Y. Well, we find lots of examples of things like that. The most beautiful example recently would be the Big Bang, the cosmic background radiation. Those of you who bump into that would know that it was originally proposed by Fred Hoyle, who said, you know, if this Big Bang, and he was the one that coined the term as an insult. He was favoring the steady state cosmology, and someone is having a cup of tea. Isn't that wonderful? Anyway, the Big Bang hypothesis was that all of the matter of the universe had once been compressed into what turns out to be kind of a singularity. And if that were true and there had been this Big Bang, Hoyle said, okay, if you calculated what it would happen as the universe expands, that initial energy is cooling. And since everything is expanding in every direction, you would expect a black body radiation at a particular degrees Kelvin, at a particular wavelength that falls in the microwave spectrum. And this would be true everywhere. And so this became an if and only if. If there was a Big Bang, there had to have been this background radiation. And the only reason why there would be such a background radiation would be if the Big Bang were true. So it was an if and only if. And for quite a few years, it was a case of, no such cosmic background radiation, because the physicists, astronomers were trying to find it, until Penzias and company, looking for something else altogether, they were trying to work out microwave communication for Bell Labs, inadvertently detected the Big Bang at exactly the area in question. In fact, they were trying to find everywhere we point our damn detector, we're getting this damn background hiss. And there were a bunch of astronomers meeting coincidentally. And they said, I wonder if this might be a cosmic phenomenon. And they said, hey, can you astronomers explain why we might be getting this microwave background radiation wherever we're pointing our detector? And they go, you've just detected the cosmic background radiation from the Big Bang. We were just trying to figure out how we were going to do that. It's one of those hilarious coincidences. And you, if you made this up, if you told the story, it would sound like you were making it up. But anyway, the idea is that all the while I've been hoping that our creationists were going to work out their hypothesis too, which is, what do they really think is happening with Homo erectus and all the other little gangs, and what evidence would be necessary for their argument, and what evidence would refute their argument, so we can tell the difference between the evolutionary hypothesis one, I'm stopping sharing now on that, I can close this little fire down, and the hypothesis two, the hypothetical creationist one. So what you end up with is a fog bank of God of the gaps, that they have this vague notion of human evolution not being true, and they cherry pick around for little itty bitty bits about things that they want to complain about. And one of the arguments that is showing up is they're pigeonholing certain taxa as humans and others presumably as not. And I was the one that they got to on this one particular page, took me hours to go plowing through all the little sources to track things down about it, had to do with the issue of brain size. Now, in an awful lot of creationist apologetics and intelligent design apologetics, they make a big deal about the fact that there's like this spectrum of brain size, and Homo erectus is actually falling into the lower range of human beings, and therefore it's not at all surprising that you should have this Homo erectus being just a variant small brain version of human beings. Well, all they're doing is riffing off of gross brain size, but that's not quite what's involved here. That's way more than just the physical volume of the brain. It's how it's configured and all of that. And so one of the sources, we're about ready to go into another exciting little screen share here. I had to manually print all of this stuff up. One of the books that they cited in the thing was Holloway et al.'s 2004 book, The Human Fossil Record, which turns out I could look at online, at least segments of it, for free. And so what I did was manually type down the information that was in a chart that was on page 5 and another chart that was on page 15 where they were cataloging. You'll notice Brodmann's areas. These are brain sections. These are parts of the brain. And you'll notice there's 17, 18, 19, 5, 7, 39, 40, 22, 37, 44, 55, 47, 8, 9, 9, 10, 11, 13, 14. A whole bunch of little brain sections that are going on. And they were noting about cortical regions, primary visual striate cortex, which does primary visual, posterior parietal, that's secondary and tertiary integration with previous area 17. All of these things are in the order of how complex brain systems that we use today layer in from one sensory layer to the next. And for example, posterior superior temporal cortex involving Brodmann's areas 2, which involves Wernicke's area, and the posterior superior gyrus, comprehension of language, all this kinds of stuff. Now, way down on page 15 was chart on reorganization changes in evolution of human brains, brain changes, the taxa involved, the time ago, and evidences. So the reduction of primary visual striate in area 17 that we can see in the brain endocasts of Alpharensis and Australopithecus afarensis, and the specific brain endocast. Remember that little word, endocast? Put that in your lexicon of terms to throw at creationists, because it's a handy one. It's when you make a brain endocast, you're taking a cast of the skull. And the point is that the innards of the brain aren't preserved, but the way they bump into the skull is. So they can tell stuff about what's going on inside the thing based upon those brain endocasts. And you can see that over time, more and more sophisticated things are happening in the early versions of Homo, and then into Homo erectus, and then finally down from Homo erectus to the present. So Homo erectus is a transitional block that's starting out way more on the apish Homo habilis and finally Africanus ends of things at one spectrum, because it involves millions of years. And then at the other end, they're just about as sophisticated as human beings are. So there's a long presentation going on. Now, this is in their source from 2004, which means Rupi theoretically could have seen all of this information. And so far, it does not look like they are mentioning any of it. Now, I'll shut this little plot down and bring up my other little thing, which, oops, that's from a different one. Yeah, actually, this will be for the climate change things, but we'll get back to that later. So the papers that I have linked are quite a few of the technical papers on brain endocasts, and you can download those at your leisure and look at them. And some of them involve Neanderthals, some of them involve comparing with archaic human beings, and you've got some Homo erectus ones, I think 3 different ones. What's revealing is that although all of these predate 2017, as far as I've seen so far, not one of them has been cited by Rupi and Sanford. In other words, all they've mentioned are sources relating to overall brain size, not what the brain looked like and what the variations are to suggest that no, Homo erectus brains don't start out just identical to humans. They're getting closer, farther along you go. They're more closer, which is exactly what you would expect a transitional series to do. It involves a huge amount of time. Homo erectus was around for, again, a couple million years. They spread all over into Eurasia. They were making more sophisticated tools. We can peek into their brains by recreating those tools, but still they're not merely brain size, but their actual brain layout is not starting out just garden variety human. And the fact that this information was theoretically known to them in one of their own sources, that it should have prodded them to investigate the little details, and that apparently they don't bother with it, is an excellent measure of why creationist systematics and brain neurology is not a going concern. So I will pause for breath, and anybody that wants to jump in there, I see Quarka Squirrel has shown up as well. And anybody want to make any comment on what I've just presented here?
You see, actually, that's where they're going with that is a large part of their own problem. You see, because even after the split between Erectus / Heidelbergensis and the branching of Neanderthalis and Sapiens, all for the genus Homo, of course, we still actually have a chunk of that period a little later on. Actually, is less than 1 million years ago. We had our brains finally finished developing to such a degree that we could start making larger scale technological changes, art, and all that other sort of nifty noise.
Every one of those components, in principle, are related to actual genes. Okay. And it's difficult to figure out what's going on, more difficult, let's say, with Homo erectus, because we don't have any living Homo erectuses to look at. Homo erecti. Whereas Neanderthals, we literally have their genes to look at. so they can start looking at stuff. And there's a lot more fossils available to where one of the things that's really useful is when they can get infants. And so you can see babies, you can see juveniles. The more fossil data that you have of fuller skeletons, they can do what shows up in the paper that I put in about the Neanderthal versus archaic humans morphometrics, which is the way the skull is shifting, the way it's growing, the way it alters. And those are telling us about the underlying genetics, and that Neanderthals, for example, don't fall into the same structure that you find with human beings. They've got a different dynamics.
RJ, I wasn't quite finished.
Oh, okay. Continue then.
What I was going
on my show
is that what I was going to say is that Neanderthal brains, at least as far as we have fossils of them, didn't make a whole lot of changes. It was sapiens that did. So the Neanderthalists had a mind like a steel trap. You told him something once, he wouldn't forget it. However, he also tended to not modify things if he didn't have to.
Yeah.
However, sapiens, as we start getting forward to about the time that Neanderthals went away, is doing exactly that. He's making modifications and producing really fun little art pieces and doing things that suggest that he not only has the imagination to continue to innovate, but he's got some free time on his hands.
Mm.
And this is...
Oh, I want to bring Abe to this in at this point, because he has a useful insight that I don't have. And that's because coming from a creationist background, he was knee-deep in stuff from Liberty University. And so he can tell us firsthand about the perceptions that he had of particularly Homo erectus bunch in the conjunction of what he was getting from his creationist literature. Fire away, Abe Tivus.
Hey, all right. Well, primarily, it's just painted the way that they're doing it today. There's been no changes in their doctrine. They don't believe in, well, primarily we remember that I come from a Southern Baptist background, and it's they're literalists, biblical literalists, and all these fossils were explained away. So very simple explanations. It wasn't a human, or that's an ape. It was an ape, or it was a deformed human. I didn't get that much into it, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I was more into the theology and apologetics.
Can you recall if they cited a lot of actual science works, or was it kind of like a summary format? And you may or may not remember, because it's been a long while. Yeah,
it's been 29 years since I've taken these courses. So, I wish I kept all my old books and everything. But
yeah, I just got to grump at you on that for not having those. But, it wouldn't dawn on you that some anal retentive scholar in the 21st century is going to grump at you for not saving all of your documentation.
Well, what I did is I put everything in storage, and I went into the Army after I got out of the ministry.
That will do it.
And something happened, and I lost the storage. So unfortunately, there goes a lot of my past.
Jackson, you were about to put in?
Oh yeah, you mentioned that they had like deformities. I think I heard that about like Homo floresiensis. So it was just these people with like small heads or whatever.
Mm.
They weren't actually this other species of human.
Yeah, that's still actually a hot area of some contention. Although it looks like most of the evidence is pushing for the idea that they actually are a remnant population of Homo erectus. They're not tiny human beings that are suffering from some eccentric deformity, because more samples have come up.
Right.
But,
I mean,
that's
they said kind of the same thing about like early Neanderthals, didn't they? Like,
oh yeah, the original one. Remember, Neanderthals in a very different position, because let's go in the Wayback Machine to 1850. This is before evolution has come along. Darwin hasn't done Origin of Species, and they find these very strange fossil bones popping up that are not really quite like humans. And the original one, I think one of the ones says, oh, these were actually Cossacks that were left over from the of Napoleonic War. That was one of the things. And then later on, when they were looking at it, they decided, oh, they're just a kind of a strange a mutant. They were suffering from some deformity of the skull and all of that. And that's because they didn't allow for there to be ancestors of humans. Even Lyle was really slow on the uptake. Oh,
today, Hovind says they're just humans with rickets.
Yeah, that's actually the old creationist viewpoints. I think even
he just says it's one human with rickets, doesn't he? He doesn't even think there's more than one. He's like, it's just an old man with rickets.
Yeah, in fact, we've got such a colossal number of Neanderthal specimens nowadays. It said, including juveniles, where they can do growth analyses on them, and of course, we got the DNA, so we can literally look.
And James, you have to also take into account that some of them just say, well, they're pre-flood men, so they just became a lot older than we were, and eyebrows keep growing, and I don't know what
that one would be grassroots viewpoint. Now, to continue the little brief historical outline in here, so in just about after the time that the early Neanderthals were being discovered, then Origin of Species comes out. Suddenly, oh, maybe evolution is on the table, but you really have to go way down the road into the 1880s and 1890s when you start finding what we now would be calling Homo erectus that are showing up in Java and others that were initially dismissed as something that was just peculiar and ape-like. And then it isn't really until the 1920s on that you start finding the Australopithecines, because now they're starting to actually investigate in Africa. You've got Raymond Dart and others doing work there. You've got Robert Broom, who was pivotal in the reptile-mammal transition phase, then moving on and because he lived down in South Africa. And so bit by bit, you start having more and more, and of course the fake Piltdown, which Jackson just did a video on, where you had basically a run for ancestors. Because look at it, Neanderthal is from the Franco-German area. That's from the continent. Well, where are all our British ancestors? We need Britons to be ahead of those bloody continentals. So that was the impetus partly for doing Piltdown. And then over in America, we were kind of pissed off. We were building skyscrapers and inventing airplanes and all of that, and saving everybody's fire in World War I. Well, where's our fossils? And so that Nebraska man was in that brief little flurry where we wanted to have higher primates over on the American side. Well, eventually the data wins out, and all of those are just kind of antiquarian issues.
And we didn't even end up having any primates in North America.
Yeah. It was for racist xenophobes. It was very annoying how the United States, even for Bigfoot, I mean, there's a wonderful 12-foot tall Gigantopithecus that would be just a dead ringer for Bigfoot if they actually had survived longer. They died out about 500,000 years ago, as far as we can tell. But they never made it over onto our side of the fence here. So, it's the romantic in me would love it if there was a remnant of Gigantopithecus actually traipsing around, scaring the daylights out of hunters in the Pacific Northwest. But yeah, I'm not not all that concerned on that front. So I'm about to because I've got a lot of guests and conversations that I want to put in here, I'm going to put in my shameless plug moment a little bit earlier. Let me put my screen share on the field here. Boop, boop, boop. And we are screen sharing. And there's my tip patrons, Stephen and Dyer and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Daniel and Ralph and Eric and Benjamin and Staggles and Alex and Totas Real and Everett and Paul. Thank you all. There's my website that was in that cute little steampunky logo that Peter came up with. And there's the Patreon website that you can go to, although they are slow as molasses. And if you really want to help the project, way better can go to GoFundMe.com, because the old RJ has stuff to do and to buy once in a while and all that kind of stuff. So there's my shameless plug. for the crowdfunding end. I think there are more than 169 people on Earth who could help. Please, please, nudge, nudge. Okay, there's the thing and another file that I can shut down on. Now, what I came up with for the second half of the show, which we're bumping into a little earlier, is the same kinds of sloppy methods that I hope I've been documenting relentlessly in the series and in my books and writings. Doesn't spill over, doesn't keep from spilling over. And just by happenstance, Denise O'Leary, who is a Canadian intelligent design advocate and who is a terrible secondary source riffer. Most of her postings up at Evolution News and Uncommon Descent are just barrages of links where she just snarks on about technical papers, and she's almost entirely riffing off of secondary source analysis. And sometimes she doesn't even understand the content of the secondary sources, because when you look at those secondary analysis, they were really quite good in explaining what the data are. She doesn't bother to read the original ones. Well, just day before yesterday, she pops up with a link to an Uncommon Descent posting, and I put it up as well as one from a creationist on climate change. The creationist one was completely source free, and it was also linked on the very same day by Answers in Genesis. So these were right topical ones. This is what the little anti-evolutionists are up to in the real world. And the critical paper that I put the link up to related to working out what the temperature variations are in the oceans caused from climate change. And the Uncommon Descent one that said, well, I haven't really studied the full content of the paper, but here's a thing I spot, that they are not reading their own charts. The climate scientists don't know how to do their own field, apparently. And so let me do a little screen share to show you what it was they had at the top of their little doodad here.
RJ, those scientists can't tell me nothing.
Yeah, indeed. I'll tell you. Well, anyway, this is what they put up. Everybody seeing our cute little charts? These are temperature range charts. This is older material that was based on less detailed analyses. And then they were generating much more recent studies where they were focusing on the various things. You'll notice the depths here, 0 to 700 meters and 700 to 2,000 meters. And there's also an additional older line that was just generically from 0 to 2,000. And you can see the bit that deeper oceans are more stable. And then there's this much bigger fluctuation, particularly since the year 2000, where the temperature variations are going up much, much more warm. And this is ocean heat content along this side. And the newer analyses is in the same general form, but more precise. And again, there's a relative stability of the deeper ocean. And then it starts to pick up as well, just as it did on this other area. So it was a refinement of already existing data. And this was the chart that supposedly the climate scientists weren't understanding, who had generated it. And this Uncommon Descent guy, I think PVM is the initials he runs under, is announcing that, well, there's an easy explanation. This deep ocean here is getting heated up by volcanoes. And the deep volcanoes from all that plate tectonic stuff is percolating up and gradually warming up the ocean above it. See, they don't understand their own science.
They say something sort of similar about the atmospheric climate change. They say, oh, what about all those volcanoes?
Mm-hmm. Well,
yeah,
here's
so
the paper that chart was from, Science Advances. I put the link up for it. And let's look at the next page where they started breaking things down according to various ocean structures and the variations that you were seeing in different oceans, Indian Ocean and North Atlantic and tropical and so forth and so on. And then, there's not talking about depths here, but just overall data fields. And then comes the clincher, because if you look here, is a detail on estimate of the ocean energy budget. And I call attention to 2,000 meters to bottom. In other words, Denise O'Leary, secondarily, and the guy at Uncommon Descent directly, was thinking that 2,000 meters was the bottom of the ocean. No, it ain't. And in fact, there is a deep water ocean, and it's really cold. It stays really cold. Even though there are volcanoes down there, there's a very long cycle of pulsing that occurs. And I put a link up to Tolstoy's paper from 2015, where she breaks down the implications of what happens with the heat driven from the deep ocean and how it connects up as little 100-year-long pulses in the climate data, not percolating up, accounting for all the temperature. And notice down here, 3 major volcanic eruptions that have been included in their data set. They're paying attention to all this information. And this was in the paper that Uncommon Descent didn't entirely bother to read all the way through. You see why I'm not terribly impressed with anti-evolution scholarship and methods?
RJ, are you telling me they don't read through the papers that they cite?
I know, it's a shocking concept, isn't it?
I mean, in your own, in your book, you talked about a lot about Gish and how he had to take all these quotes out of context when if you just looked at the paper, you'd realize, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't at all say what he wants it to say.
Yeah. And what I think is happening with the Uncommon Descent person is not that they were being willfully manipulative. It's that they are just trawling for ammo. And so there they look along. What I was immediately reminded of was Michael Denton and his misrepresentation of the reptile mammal transition, where he was going on about the jaw transition and couldn't figure out how it was generated. And it turns out it's a really simple explanation. It's the dynamic of the insectivores and their diet. And yeah, I'm getting a little tiny scrapely feedback in here. I'm not entirely sure from whom. Okay. Anyway, or maybe it's from me. I'm not entirely sure. It could be all my fault. At any rate, that just as Michael Denton had literally not studied the information that was in the paper he just cited, so too our intelligent design people were clearly not paying attention to the details of the ocean. And it didn't require a gigantic intellect to remember that the ocean is not 2,000 meters deep. It's 3 miles deep. It's thousands, many more thousands of meters deep. Oh, it's me, RJ. Yeah, I'm sorry. So whatever that's involving, it's the defects of my system. I'm getting some little scrape going on here, and I have no idea why.
RJ,
it's demons.
RJ, let's keep in mind that contrary evidence, as you say, is not allowed.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and so we never do get a working hypothesis, or if we do, we get a cockamamie one. So I guess we'll find out whether PVM at Uncommon Descent decides to work up his monograph on a volcanic impact on oceans and explain not only why it's not heating up the 700 to 2,000 meter much, but it's paying no attention at all to the stuff below 2,000 meters. How exactly is it managing to keep everything so cold down there? How do things transfer heat upwards while missing the layer in between?
That would be a really good question. Perhaps they had like some sort of insulated heat piping that just covered the distance in question. I don't know.
Yeah. There's magic piping that's piping the material. You do, in a way, one of the reasons that made climatology tricky for the last about 10 or 15 years ago particularly, but less so now because they, first of all, have much better computer modeling, and second, way more data, is the complexity of the fact that you've got all these intricate ocean currents that cycle deep water up and tropical water into the Arctic, and there's this huge underwater river that moves around, and it varies with salinity. So if you have a sudden influx of fresh water like you do in some of the times back in the when the Lake Agassiz broke up, fresh water sluicing down the St. Lawrence River and suddenly hitting this thing and changing the salinity and suddenly short-circuiting this giant river system. So all of this technique of how heat gets converted back and forth and why certain things retain different heat differentials, it's taken a long, hard work. But our idiots at Uncommon Descent are able to blunder in with such complete certainty and try to tell these people what their work is and not even bother to read their own technical papers. This is damn it unacceptable. Activist, comment on there. Are you referring to people in the thing? John Hawkes is the guy that denies that we're apes. It has to do with the nomenclature. what you brought up there is a really wonderful issue. What constitutes an ape or not? And you get a difference in systematics as to how you label something. Is somebody, Hawks doesn't disagree that we belong to the primate order and all of that kind of stuff, that there's no disputing on there. It's just have to do with what nomenclature you want to use to describe apes or not. I use as an example from somebody that a lot of people will be familiar with. What constitutes a musical? If you're talking movies, yeah. Does it have to have songs in it or not? Well, then is San Francisco, the old chestnut with Nelson Eddy's one, I can't think of the name, and see, I'm having brain farts in here. And God, I can't. This is pathetic. Anyway, 1936 movie about the San Francisco earthquake, and it's got singing in it because it's got Jeanette MacDonald doing a lot of songs in there, and they are playing them functionally with live orchestras on the set. So even though there's songs, they're not really carrying the plot with it. So is that a musical or not? Is The Great Race a musical? It's got songs where there's background orchestra that's not on stage. She's playing a guitar and there's a symphony orchestra playing behind her. That would qualify as a musical number. And there's another musical number in the thing, but yet most of the plot doesn't involve it.
Star Wars is an opera.
Yeah. So what exactly qualifies as a musical or not depends on how you want to define your terms. And so all of the bits about whether are we descended from primates? Yep. Are we descended from any living apes, which is John Hawks's point? No. We're not descended from gorillas. We're not descended from chimpanzees. We're not descended from orangutans. We're not even terribly closely related to them compared to the ones in the thicket that we are closely related to. And so it's all a matter of nomenclature. And you'll find this is an issue that you really do bump into a lot because it's a confusion that pops up over and over and over again with anti-evolutionists, because they are systematic illiterates. They don't have a systematics from their own side. You get a different frame theoretically with young Earth creationists because they have baraminology, as Jackson is well aware, but it's squishy. But they do try to work out what the created kinds are once in a while, not too often. But you move over to old Earth creationism land, that's you Ross country, or into intelligent design country like Denise O'Leary, and there is nothing, literally nothing. That's what it's really hilarious with Gunter Beckley, the intelligent design guy that apparently got religion and now he's jumped on the intelligent design bandwagon. And he's been posting a lot at the Discovery Institute now, and I've mentioned quite a few of his postings before. And he's doing the same shtick that Jonathan Wells would do. He's pot-shotting, he's authority quoting, he's saying, you can't explain this, and you can't account for this, you evolutionists, you Darwinist, you. But never chill.
Except nobody can. Let's just go through a phylogenetic tree. It's really not that hard.
No, it's real easy. Aaron Ra has a field day with it. Anybody can do it. And remember, you've got the data field. Remember that chart I put up earlier in the show? I'm calling attention deliberately to the fact that any competing hypothesis has got to account for all the data. So if you want to take on the human evolution story, you have to work out what your hypothesis is strictly. You need to account for all the data, which means you need to work out meticulously what all the taxonomical characters are and how you define being wrong. What would exactly exceed the boundary layer? What would exist? What would define a transitional form? What's something that falls in the boundary layer? And as Jackson knows, that paper that Wood did on Australopithecus sediba and lumping it in with Homo habilis and Homo erectus and humans as all the human holobaromene had to do with the fact that the creationist baraminologists are parsing their data field to begin with when they do their analyses, and they can come up with cockamamie weird outcomes because of that. And it's at least they're trying. They're trying badly. Wood is not a stupid kid, and yet they start floundering around because they're missing most of the data field. So I predict that a creationist systematics can never happen. They're never going to have a detailed scenario. Worse, Flood geology has got to scrunch everything together. Flood geology has got not one but two bottlenecks. And they haven't quite appreciated the implications of this yet. The usual model is, okay, how do we account for all the species that exist now? That's there was one created kind of finch on board the Ark. Julia Leitner, I think it's first name Julia, maybe another. Anyway,
Jean.
Leitner. Jean Leitner. And she says there are 170, 180, something like that, kinds of birds, of which one is a finch. That means all 1,200 species of finch proliferated since the Ark. And so you got a really lickety-split speciation rate that exceeds all observational limits. It's way too fast to accommodate that. But they've got another problem, is the fossil record. Remember, all the fossils are flood deposit for all practical purposes. So
except
every
for the
bird.
Isn't that what they say?
Well, except for the parts that they don't want to deal with. Yeah. Right. Yeah, there we go. There's more data flushing. But the point is, if you're looking at a Cambrian trilobite or a Dimetrodon from the Permian period, or a fossil hominid, or any of these other things that go back far enough, for all practical purposes, you are looking at flood deposit, which means every one of those taxas diversity already had to be in place before the flood, not after. So that has to have occurred from the created kinds only 1,700 years earlier or less. Oops.
You know what surprises me most is that this god is supposedly omniscient, and then goes along and packs all the dinosaurs on the Ark just to have them go extinct in just a few years after the flood. And I want to point out a dual idiot made a comment in the side chat. Young Earth creationist cladistics has to involve shipbuilding discussions.
But yes.
I thought that was awesome.
I'll point out that it's been very hard to get a list of kinds, and it's very, 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 very vague. It turns out that there is a list of the created kinds aboard the Noah's Ark at the Ark Encounter, and there's a picture of it up on their website that you can't see too clearly. If you pull up a picture, and I've downloaded it, you can see clearly enough the titles of the subsections so you can find out which ones are 14 animals per example, or which ones are 2, and whether they're extinct or not. But then when you look at the detail listings, it's so blurry I can't get any details on them, but I can count how many there are. So I did a spreadsheet, and I actually cataloged all of the ones, and they came up with a little under 1,500 kinds, of which 54% of them have gone extinct by their own count. So
well,
isn't job of preservation.
Well, you see, when even by their own standards, you can group a whole bunch of extinct animals together. Like there was a paleontologist, I think, who did a paper where he used the methods that baraminologists used to group pretty much like all the Maniraptorans together.
Oh, I think wasn't that Center?
Yeah, I think so.
Phil Center.
Yeah.
His stuff is you can Google Phil Center, and I think it's using how creation improves evolution, something like that. And there are a couple of papers. If my bibliography was up, you'll find it in the tip bibliography.
Remember, gentlemen, bats are birds.
But here's the thing: Isn't Godless Engineer about to go to visit the Ark? Maybe we can get him to make a decent picture of the list.
Absolutely, yeah. If he can do individual pictures of segments so that it's clear enough you can read them, and if that case, yay, make it available, because then I can take in my little slots in my spreadsheet and convert them into names.
Do you know where on the Ark this list is?
There's 2 charts together. There's a deck plan. It's in the same area as the deck plan, which I was surprised there's only 4 bloody decks on their Ark. I had to adjust. I had a little spreadsheet that I was doing to try to figure out how many stalls that there might be and whether or not it could work effectively. They only have 4 bloody decks. And that actually surprised me. I was figuring they'd need 6 or 8 to be able to cram animals in. So they've got way too much space in their
they
frame.
also believe the animals are all small. Like a lot of them are young ones when they're getting
or
them
go
on
to
the
sleep.
Yes, or go to sleep.
Dwayne Gish said that there would be one sauropod kind aboard, and it would go into a stupor during the actual voyage. And I said, yes, a stupor, just like the one that Dwayne Gish's brain has been in for the last 20 years.
I think, honestly, I'm not thinking Dwayne Gish and stupor actually apply to one another.
Well, at the moment, he's dead. So
like
that's and like Francisco Franco is remaining dead.
Well, understand, my little brain says that he got drunk one night and never actually recovered from the blackout.
No, he was very typical of a very dedicated apologist. He has a special place in my heart for his audacity. I've never seen anybody in the anti-evolution movement who could parse through data more tactically to suit his apologetic needs than Dwayne Gish. Jonathan Wells and Casey Luskin are rank amateurs compared to Dwayne Gish. Anybody who's read my book will know the cases where he was just so ingeniously maneuvering to parse his data to fit what he wanted to be true. And he would feed off of material. He would literally find out stuff from other critics, and he would then riff off of that and turn that to his advantage. He did the same thing. I went into this in more detail in that Dynamania chapter, where I discuss his 2 books, Evolution, The Fossils Still Say No, which is his last main book, came out in 95. And then the one that's really neglected, which is Creation Scientists Answer Their Critics, where he doesn't actually discuss creation science. He discusses evolution. And so it's a very selective little bit. But when you look those 2 books together, you can see him threading through discussions and coming up with things that he uses as ammunition later on, that the only reason he knows about him is because some critic had brought it up, and he never discusses the thing they brought up. Instead, he's trying to use ammunition from the source. He was very ingenious in that. I have no respect for it because it's manipulative and evasive, and it tramples over the relevant information. He also was interesting in that he didn't like defending young Earth creationism, that he didn't like talking about the flood. He would mention it a little bit, but a lot of people who followed him around a lot he was basically focusing on anti-evolutionism. Oh, I got some comments there in the side chat there. The Animal Man says 99.9% of all animals of old went extinct after the flood, since what we have today is only about 1% of all the genera that ever lived. Great survival plan, God. Yeah, and
it's brilliant. Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it's a terrible survival rate. And not only do you have to explain the actual taxa, but you have to explain how they got to be where they are, which is that horrible biogeography problem. And so, you get my favorite still is the grassroots creationist that was suggesting that there were koalas catapulted by volcanic eruption to Australia. I mean, you gotta give it to it for sheer dramatic interest. I mean, this is like something out of a bad science fiction movie.
RJ, I got one for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, first off, you claim that Casey Luskin is a rank amateur compared to Dwayne Gish. I agree. Mm-hmm. However, Casey Luskin wasn't hired to outdo Dwayne Gish.
Oh yeah, that was his job. He was their paleontology department, and in fact,
no. Casey was only ever used by the Disco Toot as an attack gerbil.
Yes, but you have to look at the topics he discussed, and other than the Cambrian explosion and occasional bird stuff that would get mentioned by various other people. But if you look at the paleontology theme and biogeography issue and speciation issues at the Discovery Institute, it's almost always Casey Luskin. And he was vomitously prolific. Whereas Jonathan Wells had a good angle on the Dwayne Gish of intelligent design until Luskin came along. Luskin shot past him like a racehorse. I have over 400 Casey Luskin postings in my reference bibliography. About 14% of the entire intelligent design literature is just Casey Luskin.
Ooh, that's a little bit more than I thought.
Oh, yeah. Again, I'm counting all of this stuff. I was just blown away. The closest runner-up, although he's not a technical, he's just a secondary redactor, is David Klinghoffer. He's got some 300 some odd. He's vomitous in a different way, but he's basically alluding to other people. Now, where Beckley is interesting is that he's effectively going to have to fill that role that Luskin was doing before he imploded. And we'll find out whether or not he can manage that trick long enough before the fellow paleontologists really get fed up with him and start commenting on it. And of course, I'm taking pot shots at him and following it up where all of his stuff gets into my tip bibliography. But yeah, Luskin is, you have to remember, I'll repeat this again for people who aren't aware of it, the fact claimant group, and Luskin is in that category, the ones that actually make primary source technical argument, is really small. In the entire anti-evolution movement, there are only 50 of them.
Yeah, he's 14% of
and
the
he's one of them. And the intelligent design movement is really small. Of the 50, 3/4 of them are creation scientists. And the remainder are non-creation scientists, of which, for all practical purposes, there's like a dozen of them. It's the posters at the Discovery Institute. That is the intelligent design movement. And so it's Jonathan Wells and Casey Luskin when he was still there, and Douglas Axe and Michael Behe and Michael Denton and all of that little crowd. That's it. And so their fact claimants are the ones that post directly. Whereas if you move over to creation science, most of the fact claimants in creation science are not the heavy gun stars. They're not the Ken Hovins or Ken Hams or Ray Comforts. They're not the apologists. They're the little Jason Lyles and Jeffrey Tompkins and Gene Leitners circulating around in the postings. They're well aware of them in the creation science movement, but the average anti-evolutionist critic is probably not so aware of them. And so you have a different structure going on over in creation science land. That's all the things that I discover in my spreadsheet analyses and scholarly analyses of what goes on in the source level. Now, of that block, anti-evolutionists have cited about 3,000 some odd technical papers. And that's not that many. It's bumping into only about 10% of the data field. Another measurement. Another reason why I'd like to keep at this, because literally nobody else has done this. By the way, I've been hoping that Jade and everybody else who has primary source material, oh, the idiot says, hey, James Downard, is there a particular route I should go to buy your books to make sure you get your cut? Well, Amazon.com will do it. I get that lickety-split fast, and for Kindle, if you have a Kindle reader, and you can find the links at my website for every version available. And so I will give you that right up here, and so it's easy peasy to do. I'm trying to make it painfully easy for people to part with their money and do the thing. But anyway, nobody had ever measured this issue of what technical literature had or had not been cited before, and how many people do it or not, and what branches there are. And that's part of the big project that I'm doing in the tip thing that I kind of stumbled into. It wasn't a core issue of when I started writing on the project 20 years ago. But in the last 5 years or so, I realized that the accessibility of information was so much better today. And I was effectively doing that anyway, because as I was starting to collect stuff, I would see some technical paper that some creationist had written, and they cite a bunch of technical papers, and I would look at the ones that were the really critical ones, and I would track those down, and I would do research beyond that to find out what they're. And so I would get these packets of material, and then suddenly the light bulb went off, and I'm going, wait a minute, if I just upped the scale a bit to every technical paper that they cite, I've literally measured their entire data field. And no one had ever done that before. Not anybody at the NCSE, not Jerry Coyne, not any of these others. They're just looking at it from miles away, whereas I'm looking at it completely from the data floor. And hopefully, for those who have read Slam Dunk, it leads to a different approach to this problem, and it leads to a level of confidence. When I wrote Slam Dunk, I could see from my data field that the reptile-mammal transition wasn't covered properly, that there were very few discussions on it in the pro-evolution side that were aimed at this issue. There were tons of works in the technical literature. There were books by Kemp and all these others, but how many people read those as light reading? They don't have the coffee table book of the reptile mammal transition. And the ones that were writing the book that were aimed at the general, the scientific audience, weren't discussing how anti-evolutionists dealt with the problem. Other than a few little critical articles that were critical of Duane Gish back in the 80s, there was nothing. And so I thought, hey, there's a hole. So Slam Dunk filled that hole. And now, so I've got that done, and I'm targeting all of my work along the lines of picking out things that the next book on the field will be on the Discovery Institute's Descent from Darwin list. They like to preen at all the scientists that they have on their side in their scientific revolution. Well, I'm going to be diving into the full range of their contributions or lack, and documenting how these are not heavy guns. These are not hitters in the field. They're peripheral characters. They're ones that are interlopers. They're physicists and mathematicians that decide to wax on about paleontology, or people with really stiff ideologies to grind.
Well,
RJ, down the road. Oh, jump in.
I'm sorry. I think it would be particularly dangerous for creationists to even admit that your book exists.
It'd be fun to see them deal with it, though. Everybody that follows me on Twitter knows I'm relentless in bringing up the reptile mammal transition, because then I can use it as a placeholder, because I can say, listen, nobody has explained the reptile mammal transition from the anti-evolution perspective. I don't have to guess at it. I've measured it. And therefore, go ahead and explain it. And so far, zero.
They can't. Yeah.
Well, they cannot. All they can do is dismiss it as garbage from an unqualified boob.
Yeah. Some have done that. I love the ones where suddenly they say, "Well, you're not a professor, are you? You're not a paleontologist, so you don't have a right to say this." So I'm going, like these other have a right to do this. But I've still got Christine Janis, who is a paleontologist, and she loved it. And so if I can, my goal eventually, if I can, and if anybody out of the listening audience or people in the Twitter sphere or anywhere know literary agents or publishers or anything, or people who know them, or people who know them, doesn't matter how many lines of there, I would like to eventually get regular publishers for my works and do illustrated versions. Christine Janis said the one limitation to the book is that it doesn't have pictures. It doesn't have these charts and illustrations that will show you exactly what information was being distorted by the creationist. And the reason was I didn't have the time or the wherewithal to be tracking down the rights to some of these things. And theoretically, a regular publisher would be able to do that. I've got a big stack of stuff downstairs in a little box where all the incoming material that I would be including in a revised second edition of Slam Dunk is down there. And I envisage it, since it's a smaller physical dimension book, if it was done in about the same format as Robert Prothero's paleontology book, it would probably be about the same amount of pages, even with the add-on material. And you'd be able to physically see all of those cute little charts and graphs and the details. You go, oh, that's what was under their eyeballs. Okay. And it would then function effectively as a college level reference, because Janis had no problem at all with my technical erudition on this point. And I've already corrected the few little typos that I made up. Like I occasionally misspelled crocodile, and I'm going, wow, how the hell did I avoid skipping up that one? But the idea being in the whole TIP project, the one that's farther down the road is going to be a killer. It's on speciation and kinds. There's never been an analysis of anti-evolutionists properly on this, covering it comprehensively. It's at the core of why they get their brains so screwed up. They can't conceptualize this issue at all. And I will be documenting just how badly they are on this. And so we'll be bringing up the biogeography issue and all that. And that one is even more challenging than the reptile mammal book. Well, we're at 6 o'clock. We'll probably want to wrap up in here. David Lasses is about asteroids, Zoa, the starfish, and that until creation is properly defined what a kind is, we're all effectively correct. Animal Man says, do you think they think that the pre-flood world with larger amounts of oxygen in the air for Arthropleura, Meganeura, and other large carboniferous insects? Oh, they can't think too closely on that, because you can't simultaneously have lots of oxygen in one little blob and not a lot somewhere else. And we know from regular geology that oxygen levels have fluctuated enormously over time. And we now have a relatively boring about 21%. And Michael Lovelock, with his Gaia hypothesis, I think his first name is Michael, was operating under the weird idea that nature kind of does a homeostatic thing. Well, the problem is that actually oxygen levels have fluctuated a lot. And they were at their
Peter
peak.
Ward isn't it Peter Ward, the Medea hypothesis?
Well, I don't know about his branch of it, but Lovelock in his Gaia hypothesis was the one that came up. Then Margulis liked the idea, and there is aspects of it that's legitimate. There is a certain self-calibration node. But the point is, we've seen where mass extinctions and other phenomena can upset all of that. I pointed out in the tip 1.2 at tip on the mass extinction issue that oxygen levels plummeted after the Permian mass extinction. All of that carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide crap that was putting out by the Siberian traps had wreaked havoc on the atmospheric levels, and oxygen levels dropped down to about 15% of the atmosphere. That's way lowest. That's probably the lowest they've ever been up after the great oxidization event. The highest, it was pushing close to 50% at times, as I recall, during the dinosaur period. And that's probably one of the things that gave dinosaurs a leg up, because they have a faster metabolism, and they didn't need to necessarily have to have a conventional warm-bloodedness to get a lot of bang from the buck, as opposed to those damn little fur balls that had to maintain a mammalian-style metabolism. But another area where the high oxygen levels definitely was at 50% or so was in the Carboniferous. The plants were just spewing it out, and that's why you had really big bugs, because insects breathe through their skin. And so the ease of oxygenation, that's why you got dragonflies with 3-foot wingspans and centipedes that you would go, ah, if they started crawling into your area because they were 6 feet long. And things never got that big again. And you have the same limitation in other contexts. Just like this is a throwaway on the origin of life issue. It's an intriguing little sidebar that I've been collecting a little bit of information on. It's still very, very speculative at my end, but it is intriguing that people forget a detail about the early history of the Earth. And that is that when the moon was spun off and coalesced after the impactor created all of that, the Earth was spinning way faster than what it's used to. And so what we now know with its 24-hour days, it was only like about 15 hours or something, 18 hours or so, much, much faster. And the moon, of course, was much closer, and tides were much bigger, so that there would have been a much higher tidal cycles than what we're used to today. And theoretically, if the dynamo had started up, the magnetic field is higher. And it would have been reducing more and more gradually. By the time you get to the dinosaur period, the recession rate's much slower, and the slowing down of the Earth is much more gradual, and it's more stable. But at the very beginning, theoretically, there may be factors where I'm wondering whether there are certain chemical reactions and bondings that are affected by magnetic fields. And I'm wondering whether that may play a little bit of a role. David Lass said, weren't there about 400 days in a year at that time? I think it was like it because, yeah, the year was about the same. It was that the spinning of the Earth is faster, so that the day was shorter. Yes. Yeah. So I don't offer this as the end-all solution of it, but it's an interesting thing that I kind of keep a tab on, that they may have not taken into account the fact that some chemical bondings and reactions can be affected by magnetic fields, and there would have been probably a little higher magnetic field at the time. Who knows? Anyway, everybody want to weigh in on closing comments here, since we're past the 6 o'clock hour, and to reprieve any of the issues that we were discussing earlier, from Homo erectus brain endocasts to how intelligent designers don't read science papers very well.
No, you covered it.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do folks read it all? Because I know they're not reading their Bibles. They can't.
Well, I'm charitable, but cruel. That when you look at one of the things that shows up in the tip work is the vast majority, and the Twitter accounts are the same sort of a thing. The vast majority of anti-evolutionists don't study a damn thing. They haven't read any technical papers. They have buzzwords that they use, but when you probe them on where they're getting the information from, they clam up. That's why source methods is so vicious as a technique on it. And of course, you can explain.
Hogan and Dwayne Gish got so freaking popular.
Well, and it's easy because they're good at, and Donald Trump for that matter, they're very good at tropes, and they say what people want to be true, and they move like lickety split and all of that. But the core group do read. They do attend to science material. I've never seen anybody barrage technical citations as much as Andrew Snelling in one of his creationist papers. I mean, it's a pile up. And a couple analyses that I did, it took me months to plow down, and I only just recently got them all plugged into the data field, even though I'd collected the information months ago, because it's just a lot of work.
I'm going to hurt Snelling.
I don't know. Is Snelling on Twitter?
I found a claim he made. I'm going to have to dig it back up, but I'm going to use that claim to turn it inside out.
Listen, guys. Yeah. Listen, guys. When I was a creationist, I lived in a bubble. And if you had asked me, did you read this paper or a science paper? Did you read this science book? I would have said no, because I was, what the information I had in front of me and what I listened to on a daily basis, that was sufficient to my mind. And it didn't even cross my mind to question anything about the Bible.
Yeah. And I don't claim to be cuddly and sweet enough to be able to typically inspire those who are non-Tortucan creationists raised in it, to be able to inspire them onto it. What I do hope to do is to function as a catalyst. There are a lot of people, there are educators like Amanda Smith down in Georgia. She's a wonderful educator. Amanda Glaze, yeah. And you can follow her on Twitter and that. She is a wonderful example of somebody who's in the trenches in the educational world, and she has to deal with the things from that direct end. And she has a marvelous ability to deal with things. Samantha, or who Peter knows her, weighed in on the discussion with Dr. Dre briefly. The people like that often have very better abilities than I do. I'm a detail geek. I can be sarcastic and all the rest. And so everybody has to pull together, and different people have different skill sets for persuasion and opening up doorways. But what we can have is the network that we can gather together so that we can marshal our resources very effectively. And so the point I raised earlier that I kind of got sidetracked on about Jade and others who have huge blocks of information that they've acquired over the years, we got to make that information available to people so that it's not tucked away in somebody's closet somewhere, but is accessible for people to look at. And so I've been trying to do that to start up with my tip material. And Jade definitely needs to do that with a lot of the textbooks and stuff that she's tracked down primary source material that's inaccessible online. And she should start up a WordPress page or something and put some of this material up, scan it, and do PDFs and stuff so everybody can make use of it. Because the more information we have accessible, the more documentation we do, the more familiarity we are with the issues of not only our side, but the opponent's side, only can improve our ability to respond to these things. That's the point I'm making on how methods matter. Well, here we are at 6:10. Any final closing comments? Jackson, you want to pop up and give a thing, because you've been mum as a church mouse over there.
I've been taking in all of this information. Also, if you haven't read RJ's book, it's really good. And he also talks about the source methods approach there. And it's really neat. It's really fun to apply to creationists, especially when you meet them on the street.
Yeah, well, that's another matter too. I contend that what can throw a lot of defenders of science off is, one, that they're not maybe as familiar with the data field as they need to for their own side. And they also may not be sufficiently familiar with the data field of the opponents. Now, someone like Apetivist has a wonderful advantage because he was raised in a religious background, so he knows their tropes. And so we can respond to them in a way that's different than somebody that comes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the same thing on the science end. Although we've all seen examples of professors and scientists who are really knowledgeable and respected, but they're not exactly live wires in quick discussion.
Oh no, and a lot of them don't want to be in those discussions because they're either so busy or they just don't have the time to do it.
And there were I remember with the no free lunch theorem that Bill Dembski was trotting out. That I contacted the two authors of the actual no free lunch paper. And one of them was keen and did directly criticize Bill Dembski. And Dembski has made a point of not really discussing that. But the other author basically took no, don't want to get involved with that. No, nah. And so there are a lot of ones who...
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, RJ.
No, jump in.
The latter approach is the one that, as far as I've seen, biologists and scientists generally tend to take when they see. I even brought the paper because Answers in Genesis wrote a paper on one of Dr. Esselstyn's finds, an intern for Dr. Esselstyn, and he just kind of read it and was like, oh well. Yeah. They don't really want to engage with the other side, which is not their fault. They're busy.
Yeah, they're very busy. They don't see any benefit to it. And that's why we down in the trenches get to do this instead. That nothing prevents us from dealing with it. Always to make sure we get our facts right. I've had a lot of different contacts with people, like the Southron paper on the diamonds. When I couldn't get that open access, I wrote him, emailed him, and he kindly dispatched it, sent it to me. And then when I looked over and make sure that my argument was correct, I checked with him and says, is my understanding of this paper accurate? And he goes, yep, And so he doesn't have to fight the fight. I can fight the fight for him. Oh, we got a thing from Animal. James noted, in terms of the history of life on Earth, I never was in a huge religious bubble. I always understood science, probably because I kept watching the Walking With series. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there, although even well-done science programs can occasionally glitch up, and there's a certain extent to which they're going for the cute visual and all of that. But what I've done when I'm watching one of those programs, I'm often taking notes. If there's something that I don't know about, if there's an animal that's mentioned or a particular scientist, they flash their name on the field and they're doing something that's interesting, that they're just talking about the content of it, but they're not citing a technical paper, you can Google them and find out what their work is, what journals have they printed in, what stuff, and you can see how their work is reacted. And then you can also tell when things are not as well developed, that there's a controversial theory that might be presented. And when you try to Google the background of it, you discover that they haven't published in a serious journal yet. It's all on websites. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to turn out to be wrong, but that puts a little flag up that, no, it hasn't been vetted through the field yet. And then sometimes you'll discover that when you do the background research, you find the genuine material may have been done by some else completely. I've seen science shows where they aren't actually dealing with the ones doing the work. They're dealing with some secondary redactor who's trying to kind of play off of the work. They're not actually the one doing the stuff, and they're the talking head that they've gotten into. So you can start laying out the field and seeing where you are on this kind of stuff. I always say to people, pick an area you really like. Don't figure that you can or need to research every bloody thing that's ever been done, but try to pick an area that's salient and that you adore, that you're going to want to know about anyway, and then ground it ever more in primary source material rather than just relying upon accounts that are online or general books. And you can make use of that general material, even Wikipedia. There's nothing wrong with using Wikipedia as a springboard. I will often look to see whether or not what the Wikipedia listing is, and sometimes I go, wow, they don't have a technical paper on this yet. Okay, well, if they don't have a technical paper on it, that may indicate that it's too cutting edge to have dust settled, and that means you put a little question mark around it. And so all of these are methods, tools that you can do to avoid walking off gangplanks and pressing into areas that are awkward. As anybody who's been following me online ought to know, I try to warn people off of jumping off the damn origins or bust gangplank. Good God, try to avoid getting involved in origin of life issues, because it's still unsettled, and you're just going to be dancing around presuppositions all day long. And by the
True.
time if you want to dive into the technical literature, it'll be pretty deep. And watch out about that. Were you going to say something, Aptivist?
Oh, no. I have nothing to add.
Yeah, it's all a matter of applied things. I'm still a learning curve myself. If Peter can finally arrange that debate with Kent Hovind, we can see how well I can do on that one. It's still a coming attraction.
I'm surprised he's not tired of getting destroyed yet. I mean, like 3 times in the past year, he's gotten roasted. So I guess he's just a glutton for.
From his point of view, he's never lost.
No problem.
Yep.
The major,
Yeah, from his point of view, yeah.
he cannot lose. It is not possible. And therefore,
the other people
say too much. Looks at what happens and goes, "Damn, Kent, what the hell did you just walk into? Did you do that on purpose?"
And remember, Kent's supporters ain't going to fact check him.
We did a good job. Yep, all busted.
No, in any debate that I would be doing, I am not there to persuade them that they're wrong. I am there to present a science evidence and my own argument fairly and rigorously. And anybody watching from the sidelines, it could be the future aptivists and other people who just need the little nudge into the big world to where they go, I want to look for this on my own, because that Downard guy really was careful and he seemed to know the facts better than the Hovind guy did. That's the goal that I want to have in debates. And ideally, my arrogant bastard self would love it that I would seldom do debates. Not because I won't debate, but because everybody's terrified of me.
James,
that's my dream.
There's only one thing I'm afraid of.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it happens, I'll be moderating. So I'll be moderating 2 guys who can talk more than anyone else on the planet. And I need to get...
Oh, by the way...
I need to get some kind of...
Peter moderated a talk between Mr. ID and Aaron Raw. He can moderate anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is... Yeah, indeed. And the other area that I would recommend having some people standing by whose sole job is to mark down how long each of us talk to make sure that we're both even. So he can't complain about it.
James, hold on. I was not alone moderating Aaron Raw with Mr. ID. I had
You did
help.
most of the work. You did most of the work.
You did some yourself. So
well, then here's a bit. The idea that you two make a great tag team.
Yeah, I think
there we go. Fist bump on the internet.
We did fairly well considering what was going on.
Considering everything.
Yeah.
No, I have no illusions. There are some groups like the National Center for Science Education crowd generally don't like the idea of debates. And there's quite a lot of the camp in the anti-creationism community that thinks they're a waste of time. And if you're approaching them from the, boy, you're going to do the thing where you're going to persuade their followers to all turn around and support the opposite position. No. That's not what I'm there for. And to my mind, it's a thing that if somebody is purveying twaddle, that it is the duty of people who know it to be twaddle to present a good explanation of why it is twaddle and to be up on their game. There's no excuse not to know what Kent Hovind's views are. He spews them. I mean, that's what made, I can always remember, it's not Hudlow, the human evolution guy, did a wonderful job because he had watched the Hovind debates. Yeah, Ludlow. Yeah, I have a friend here whose name is Hudlow, and I'm always confusing them because they sound so similar. But he did a really splendid
his talk
job
was great
because he'd researched him, and so he had literally his posts that he was going to use and the counter argument right handy. So that was an excellent opportunity to do. Animal says, can you talk about Ham Park's featherless Deinonychus? Even without feathers, it looks like a juvenile T-Rex more than a Deinonychus. For those who want, I go into a lot of these things in the 3 Macroevolutionary episode PDF that you can find at my website. It's free. Download it, share it around. And it's got pictures because I'm not making any money out of it, so I don't have to worry about copyright infringement because I'm not actually generating any revenue from it. But the thing is that if you look at, it's not merely Deinonychids. Those, which by the way, that's Velociraptor from the Jurassic Park movie. The name was given to it mistakenly. Deinonychus is the great big human-sized predator with the little sickle cells and all that, sickle claws. What reason why that jump-started bird evolution so much is because it was so bird-like in his anatomy, and the fact that the pubic structure that was in the old Saurischian mode had morphed around to a bird-like mode in these Deinonychids, and it's the same true for all of those Troodontids and Maniraptor theropods. And so much about the physical anatomy had made sense that John Ostrom in particular started jump-starting the issue and changing the dynamics. But even Archaeopteryx, several of the Archaeopteryx specimens were misinterpreted as dinosaurs initially because the feather impressions were so weak on them, on some of them. And so the similarity between birds and dinosaurs struck Huxley back in the 19th century.
They've been identified as Deinonychosaurs before, haven't they? Archaeopteryx?
No, I think Compsognathus, or Coelophysis, or one of the two. I refer to it in the thing. Yeah, it was one of the. It's the one that I can't remember because I get them confused because they start with C. But whichever, I think it may have been Compsognathus. But anyway, they're only known from 2 specimens. Those dinosaurs. One of them in France, it's a fragmentary one, and the other one that's in the Solnhofen. So we have to all remember the extent to which fossil deposits. All of the Archaeopteryxes are from one deposit, Solnhofen. So we have no idea how big their range was, even though we now know from some of the specimens that there were at least 2 species coexisting, because one of the variations on one of the specimens that they found in the last couple of years is so much apart that it's very probably a separate species. And but just how wide-ranging they were, where you have to remember, but going back in time in the Wayback Machine again, Europe wasn't a continent, it was a series of islands, an archipelago. And so there was a lot of watery real estate going around in there. And so you're talking about a series of islands. And Alan Fiducia, who's no friend of the dinosaur bird theory, but he makes probably a valid point that just as birds proliferated in island arc distributions, it's very probable that dynamic was going on in early bird evolution, as things would fly to the next island and then they would start developing kind of differently on their own. But because there's so few deposits from that Jurassic era and no other Lagerstätten deposits, that fancy little word with the umlaut that means the mother lode deposits, there's only the Solnhofen, that's it. And then maybe the Chinese deposits, the earliest branch of that Jehol or whatever it is over in China dates back into the Jurassic, but only fragments of it. So it's a limited data field. Anyway, Compsognathus, thank you, Animal Man. Coelophysis is known by several species. Coelophysis was the other one that's the little pack hunter in the second Jurassic Park movie. See, you can study the paleontology by watching Jurassic Park movies. But yeah, Compsognathus. I got them correctly illustrated. And you can see how similar Deinonychids and Archaeopterygids are, and theropods in general. The branch of dinosaur formes that are at the very base of the dinosaur branchings. If you look at the earliest Herrerasaurs and earliest Ornithischian dinosaurs, they all look a lot alike. And you really need to be a trained paleontologist to spot, oh, that little skull bone arrangement is actually enough farther apart that these are actually not that closely branching lineages in that early group.
Isn't that kind of why it's hard to figure out the deep roots of the dinosaur tree? Why you could go with the new Ornithocellular tree or the old one, because they all look about the same.
That Herrerasaurs finally got their day in the sun. I allude to Herrerasaurs just a wee bit in the old book, and that was written in 15 years ago. And there were relatively few deposits. Matter of fact, your Proto-Avis that you bumped into, it's an argument that some of the pieces of that Proto-Avis fossil were probably bits of Herrerasaurs. And so that there was a thing. So you had a diversity of proto-dinosaurs that were just coming onto the scope in the 1990s, just as some of these new bird fossils were coming onto the scope. Well, a lot more data is down in the field. And that's why that new reevaluation popped up in, I think, Nature magazine just a little ways ago, because now you have so many more things that now they can start analyzing it with cladistic analyses, because the more character states and the more fossil examples you have, the more blips on the scope, the more you can work that out. And so the fact that it turned out that Herrerasaurs and Saurischians were branching in one grouping as opposed to the ones that branched off into theropods and ornithischians, it didn't surprise me, and it did not shock me that such a thing was possible, because of the fact that the Herrerasaurs were always thumbing their nose at us that there's an animal that's got kind of not quite Saurischian, not quite ornithischian layouts, and it's what the hell are they? And so it's the other bit. There's another one where I alluded to in just a little video a little ways back about how Cornelius Hunter shot his mouth off on dinosaur diversity, and he was thinking that just because dinosaurs spread very quickly, that somehow they're all the ones that he's familiar with. No, they're all pretty much the same model, but they're spreading quickly. And he never bothered to look at the details on it. Well, anyway, we're about a half hour past our hour-long show. And so I hope everybody has enjoyed the discussion today. Thank you very much for Aptivist for coming on. I hope it was not a bad experience for you.
No, it's a wonderful experience. I don't think I know a single person alive that knows as much about his field as you do. I mean, I'd love to meet someone that is as knowledgeable in this area as you.
Well, I find out how little I know on some fields when I bump into some experts in the field in some of these specialized areas, because I'm not a professional paleontologist or whatever. But what I will say is I am trained in sound scholarly method. That's what I studied and did a lot of in college. And on that's my turf. So can I read a source? Can I check a footnote? Can I look to see who cited what and who didn't? Oh boy, you can measure all that precisely. And I'm trying to demonstrate by behavior and by actions, and how Jackson effectively, then Paul Oggia. These are all people who are functionally came on their own to a source methods approach. And I'm just kind of saying, nudge, 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 go even more for the primary source data, because it improves your argument, improves your understanding, and makes it way easier to go side the head. Yeah, right. Jump in.
Can I say something? Talking about source methods, Bill Nye on season 3, episode 5 was talking about evolution. And in there, he had Derek Mueller do a piece in London about the London Underground and the mosquito that had supposedly evolved in that in the underground. But I've decided to not take them on their word. And I did some research, and it's hotly contested at this point whether or not Culex pipiens
in actual speciation.
I think Culex molestus is generally considered its own species.
Okay, great. Yeah,
at least from what I've read. I
can't find information that says that. Culex pipiens molestus is at this point it's still hotly debated. And
that's a good one. That's a good one to deal with. We'll have to do a follow up on that.
But if they had done some research,
I think I got some sources on it in my bibliography. But Jackson, I know, will find some material on it. And at the very least, any material that you pop up, go ahead and put it in on the comments in the actual video feed rather than the interior comments here, so everybody can follow along, and we can thrash it over.
Surely they could have found something better to talk about that's not as hotly contested.
Yeah,
I sent Bill Nye a message about it, and I said, look, I'm no scientist, but I was able to do 30 minutes of research and came up with this point, that you guys.
I was disappointed with Nye's book. I thought it was the one where he discussed creationism and the like, and that it was a generic, relatively superficial, undocumented. He wasn't putting in references, and that some of the stuff in it was skirting perilously close to yes, but.
That was a really weird thing that he had no bibliography in it. That was super weird.
Yeah. And if having no bibliography is a problem for a creationist, it's a problem for Bill Nye. That you need to follow up. I've seen general works written by scientists that are not documented tightly, but nonetheless you can track down the material, so you can find out and provide that information. But still, I want that material to be in there, because what you want with any book is the ability to extract the information fairly, and you want to be able to follow up on it so that nobody has to take your damn word for it, that you can do your own follow-up and you can test it out. And if you do it in enough detail, you can see when you do test it out, it has the ring of truth, and that increases your reliability in the person. So this may explain maybe why Bill Nye was not necessarily the best person to debate Ken Ham.
No, I don't think he was.
He had to have a crash course. Josh Rosenau and the NCSE bunch had to basically introduce him to Ken Ham's videos in a hurry. And you can't get up to speed on a subject like that quick. There's way too much information involved. And so if you don't know it, there were example after example of things that Ham was bringing up in his debate that I was going, golden opportunity, and nothing came of it.
Yeah.
And I think that the saddest example was that it wasn't Bill Nye who brought up the killer question. It was somebody in the audience. What evidence would change your mind? That's a core methods question. And it wasn't Ham who brought it up.
Yeah, it wasn't. Right.
Yeah. Well, anyway, now we're even farther past being passed. I guess that'll do. I will be stopping the broadcast now. Thank you all for showing up on the show. I think we had a fun material in there. I'll be looking to see what kind of comments people have on that, and we'll check up on that Kulex thing, because that is I'm trying to scavenge my memory about it. It partly involves the ability to do the research thing, but I know there are technical papers on it, and I think they're like about 5 or 6 years ago.
Kind of interesting. It
Jackson, maybe you can do a video on it.
Yeah.
Well, it already seems that the idea that they started out in the London, or they started out in the London tunnels during the Blitzkrieg was false. They've actually been known about since the 18th century.
Ah, okay.
Right.
So they So they
may have a longer time frame involved.
Yeah,
so
they were known
since a bit of a controversy. But see, we'll all learn more about the subject as a result of this. And there can never be a downside to fact checking, ever, because you'll always put your thing, no matter how big the authority is. That's why I can't tell everybody, don't take my damn word for it. Check me out. And if I've made a goof or a mistake on the thing, then I need to correct. And that improves the argument. And so collectively, we want to build a network of people so that we are formidable, really formidable. True. And that we will strike terror into the hearts of wooists everywhere, because they'll know that they're going to have to work damned hard to keep up with our scholarship and accuracy. Okay, closing down for the night, and see you all next week, gang, and happy thinking.